Hello and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we drift off into the history, biblical meaning, and significance of Palm Sunday. Before we dive in, if you're looking for ways to relax and sleep better naturally, check out the link in the video description below. Let's dive in. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on the side of a dusty road. The sun is warm on your face. The air smells of dry earth and olive trees. Around you, people are beginning to gather, not in the frantic way of a crowd expecting trouble, but in the quiet, expectant way of people who have been waiting for something, waiting for a very long time. You don't know exactly what is about to happen, but you can feel it. There is something in the air on this day that feels different from every other day. Something is coming. Someone is coming. This is Jerusalem, and the day is what we now call Palm Sunday. To understand why this day matters so deeply to the Christian faith, we have to understand the world it happened in. Jerusalem, in the first century, was a city caught between two worlds. It was the spiritual heart of the Jewish people, the home of the great temple, the place where heaven and earth were believed to touch. But it was also a city under Roman occupation. Roman soldiers walked its streets. Roman laws governed its people. And the Jewish people, many of them, lived with a quiet, aching longing for something to change. The Romans were not known for their gentleness. They ruled with power, with display, with force. When a Roman general or governor entered a city, he did so in what was called a triumphal procession, riding a great war horse, surrounded by soldiers, his conquests on full display. The message was always the same: I'm powerful, you're not, submit. And so the people of Jerusalem knew very well what it looked like when a ruler arrived. But on this particular Sunday, something arrived that looked nothing like Roman power and everything like an ancient promise. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and he had been traveling toward Jerusalem for days, moving through the countryside of Judea, teaching and healing as he went. Word had traveled ahead of him. It always did. There were people who had seen things, remarkable things, things they struggled to explain. A man born blind who could now see. A man called Lazarus who had been dead for 4 days and had walked out of his tomb. Stories like these do not stay quiet. They move through villages like wind through grass. And so by the time Jesus reached the outskirts of Jerusalem, on the gentle slope of the Mount of Olives, people were already watching, already waiting. Now here's where this story does something beautiful and deliberate. Before Jesus entered the city, he sent 2 of his disciples ahead with a very specific instruction. He told them to go into a nearby village, and that there they would find a young donkey tied up, one that had never been ridden. He asked them to bring it to him, and if anyone asked why they were untying it, they were simply to say, "The Lord has need of it." It happened exactly as he said it would. The disciples found the donkey, brought it back, laid their cloaks over it as a kind of makeshift saddle, and Jesus sat upon it. And then he began to ride, slowly, humbly, down the slope of the Mount of Olives, toward the city of Jerusalem. Now to modern ears, a man riding a donkey might not sound like a grand statement. But to the people watching that day, who knew their scriptures, who had grown up hearing the ancient writings read aloud in the synagogue, to those people, this image was electric, because hundreds of years before this moment, a prophet named Zechariah had written these words: "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus was not simply traveling into Jerusalem. He was fulfilling a prophecy. He was making a declaration. But the declaration was not one of military might or political ambition. It was something far more unexpected. He was presenting himself as a king, but a king who came in peace. A king who chose the humble animal of a common working man over the proud war horse of a conqueror. It was a gentle revolution, and the people felt it. As he rode down from the Mount of Olives, something remarkable began to happen along the sides of the road. People started cutting branches from the palm trees that grew in the area and laying them down on the road before him. Others spread their cloaks on the ground, their own garments, the clothes off their backs, making a kind of living carpet for him to ride upon. Palm branches, in that culture, carried a deep meaning. They were a symbol of victory, of honor, of royalty. When a great ruler or hero passed through, palms were waved and scattered. It was the ancient world's version of a standing ovation, and the people were giving it, freely, joyfully, without being asked. And then they began to cry out. The word they used was one that had deep roots in Jewish worship and prayer. They cried out Hosanna, a word that originally meant save us now, or please save. It was a cry from the Psalms, from the ancient hymns of Israel. But on this day, it spilled out of them not like a formal religious recitation, but like something they couldn't hold back. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. They were calling him the Son of David, one of the most significant titles they could give. David had been Israel's greatest king, a man after God's own heart, a warrior and poet and leader who had united his people and established Jerusalem as their holy city. For 1,000 years, the Jewish people had hoped and prayed and believed that one day, a descendant of David would come, a Messiah, an anointed one, who would restore what had been lost. And here, in the eyes of this crowd, was that man, riding a donkey, coming in peace, coming toward them. Luke's Gospel, one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life written in the first century, tells us something tender about this moment. As Jesus rode toward the city and it came into full view before him, the gleaming white stone of the temple, the towers and walls of Jerusalem shining in the morning light, he stopped and he wept. He wept over the city in a moment that was being celebrated around him. With palm branches waving and voices singing, Jesus was moved to tears. He said, according to Luke, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. There was a sorrow in him, even in the midst of the celebration, a knowledge of what was coming, a love for this city and these people that ran so deep it broke his heart open. This is one of the details that makes the Palm Sunday story so quietly devastating in its tenderness. The crowd was celebrating a king. The king was grieving for his people. Both things were true at once. When he finally entered the city itself, Jerusalem was stirred. The Greek word used in Matthew's Gospel suggests the whole city was shaken, buzzing, asking the question, who is this? And the crowds who had followed him and answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. The religious leaders of the city, the chief priests and the Pharisees, watched all of this with deep unease. Some of them called out to Jesus from the crowd, asking him to rebuke his disciples, to quiet this celebration, to stop letting people call him a king. And Jesus answered them with a line that has echoed through history ever since. He said, I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out, as if to say, this moment will be acknowledged. The truth of who I am cannot be silenced. Even creation itself would find a voice for it. And so this is where our story begins, on a road outside Jerusalem, with palm branches and cloaks spread on the ground, with a crowd singing and weeping and hoping, with a man on a donkey who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would cost him, and came anyway. Palm Sunday is celebrated by Christians every year on the Sunday before Easter. It marks the beginning of what is called Holy Week, the most sacred 7 days in the Christian calendar. The days that follow Palm Sunday move through betrayal and trial and crucifixion and, finally, resurrection. It is a week that contains the full spectrum of human experience: joy and grief, hope and despair, love and loss, and it all begins here, on this road, with these palm branches, with this quiet, weeping king. There is something deeply human about the Palm Sunday story. The crowd that celebrated Jesus on Sunday would, by Friday, be largely silent. The same city that spread cloaks before him would, within days, call for his execution. Theologians and storytellers have wrestled with this for 2,000 years. How quickly the mood can shift, how fragile celebration can be, how often we misunderstand the very things we are celebrating. But perhaps it is part of what makes this story so enduring. It does not flatter the crowd. It does not pretend that the enthusiasm was permanent or that the people fully understood what they were welcoming. It simply shows us the moment, this beautiful, complicated, hope-filled moment, and lets it be what it was. A king came. He came humbly. He came on a donkey, on a road, into a city that was both his and not his. And for one brief, shining morning, the people of Jerusalem lifted their voices and their branches toward the sky and sang. And even the stones, if you listen closely enough, might still be singing. There is something about a city that holds its breath. Jerusalem, in the hours and days following that extraordinary Sunday morning, was a city doing exactly that. The palm branches had been laid down. The cloaks had been gathered back up. The voices that had sung so freely were quieter now, returning to the rhythms of ordinary life. The marketplace, the cooking fire, the evening prayer. But something had shifted. Something had settled into the stones of the city, like a change in the weather that everyone could feel, but no one could quite name. Jesus was here, and nothing would be the same. To understand what happened next, we have to understand just a little more about the world Jesus had entered. Because Jerusalem during this particular week was not its quieter, everyday self. This was Passover week. Passover is one of the most sacred celebrations in the Jewish faith, and it remains so to this day. It commemorates one of the foundational stories of the Jewish people, the story of the Exodus, when God, through Moses, led the Israelites out of centuries of slavery in Egypt. The night before their departure, the scriptures tell us, God passed over the homes of the Israelites, homes marked with the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, and spared them from the final, terrible plague that fell upon Egypt. It was the night everything changed, the night a people became free. And every year, Jewish families and pilgrims gathered in Jerusalem to remember that night, to eat the Passover meal together, the lamb, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and to tell the story again, as it had been told for generations. We were slaves. God heard our cry, and God brought us out. During Passover week, Jerusalem's population swelled dramatically. Pilgrims came from across the region, from Galilee in the north, from the communities scattered across the Roman Empire, from Egypt and Syria and beyond. Some historians estimate that the city, which held perhaps 60 to 80,000 people in ordinary times, could swell to several 100,000 during Passover. Every inn was full. Every courtyard held sleeping visitors. The city was alive with memory and meaning and a kind of holy electricity. It was into this charged atmosphere that Jesus had ridden on his donkey. And it was in this atmosphere that the religious authorities, already watching him closely, now watched him with something closer to alarm. Because Jesus, upon entering the city on that Sunday, had done something that made very clear he had not come simply to observe the festival quietly and then go home. He had gone to the temple. The temple in Jerusalem was not merely a place of worship, in the way we might think of a church or a chapel today. It was the center of the entire Jewish world. It was where sacrifices were offered, where prayers ascended, where the presence of God was believed to dwell in the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, behind a great curtain that no ordinary person could pass through. It was magnificent in scale and in meaning. Herod the Great, the king who had ruled before the Roman governors, had spent decades expanding and beautifying it. Its white stone caught the sunlight and made it visible from miles away, gleaming like something not entirely of this earth. And the temple complex was also, during Passover week, a place of extraordinary busyness. Pilgrims needed animals for their sacrifices, doves, lambs, cattle, and these animals were sold right there in the outer courts. Money changers set up their tables because Roman coins, bearing the image of Caesar, were considered unsuitable for temple offerings, and they needed to be exchanged for the proper temple currency. It was commerce woven into worship, business occupying the space of prayer. And when Jesus walked into that outer court and saw it, the tables, the coins, the cages of birds, the noise and the commerce and the confusion, something rose up in him that was very different from the gentle, weeping figure who had paused on the road to grieve over the city. The Gospels tell us that Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out those who were buying and selling. He scattered the coins across the stone floor. He released the doves from their cages. And in the midst of this extraordinary act, he quoted the ancient prophets, combining the words of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." This moment is important to sit with, because it reveals something about the Jesus of the Palm Sunday story that the gentle image of the donkey ride might not fully capture. He was not simply a quiet teacher offering soothing words. He was someone who cared deeply, fiercely, about what the temple was meant to be, about what worship was meant to be, about the difference between genuine encounter with the sacred and the hollow going through of motions dressed up in religious clothing. The clearing of the temple, as this event is known, was not a random act of anger. It was a prophetic statement. It was Jesus declaring, in the most visible and dramatic way possible, that something had gone wrong, and that he had the authority to say so. And the religious authorities, watching all of this, understood perfectly. Their unease deepened into something harder and colder. They began, from this point, to look for a way to stop him, but the crowds kept coming to him. Matthew's gospel tells us that after the temple was cleared, the blind and the lame came to him there in the temple courts, and he healed them. And the children who had perhaps followed the procession in from the road, who had watched with wide eyes as the adults waved their palm branches, were still calling out in the temple, still singing, "Hosanna to the Son of David." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and were indignant. They asked Jesus if he heard what the children were saying. And again, he answered them with scripture, this time from the Psalms. "Have you never read, from the mouths of children and infants you, Lord, have called forth your praise?" There is something quietly beautiful about the children in this story. Adults are complicated. They carry agendas and fears and political calculations. They weigh their words and measure their loyalties. But children simply responded to what they saw, and what they saw in Jesus moved them to sing. As evening came on that Sunday, Jesus left the city and went out to Bethany, a small village about 2 miles from Jerusalem, on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. This was a place he knew well. It was the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. It was, in some sense, his place of rest, his shelter from the intensity of the city. He would return to Jerusalem each day during that week, teach in the temple courts, Speak to the crowds. Engage with the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees who came to question him, to test him, to try to catch him in a contradiction or a heresy. And each evening he would return to Bethany, to the quietness of the hillside and the olive trees and the people who loved him. This rhythm, entering the city, teaching, withdrawing, returning, gives the week a kind of tide-like quality, an advance and a retreat, a going in and a coming out, as though Jesus was moving toward something, step by careful step, day by deliberate day. Now, let us go back for a moment to the palm branches, because they carry a story of their own that is worth telling slowly. The palm tree has been woven through human history for thousands of years. In the ancient Near East, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the lands of the Bible, the date palm was a symbol of life itself. It provided food and shade and shelter in landscapes that could be mercilessly hot and dry. Its branches were used in celebration, in construction, in ritual. To wave a palm branch was to say, something worth honoring is here. In the Jewish tradition specifically, palm branches were part of the celebration of Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles, one of the great pilgrimage feasts of the year. The people would carry branches of palm and myrtle and willow and wave them before the Lord in the temple. The act of waving branches was inseparable from worship, from joy, from the acknowledgement of God's provision and faithfulness. And there was another layer, too. About 160 years before Jesus rode into Jerusalem, a group of Jewish rebels called the Maccabees had retaken Jerusalem from the Seleucid Empire that had desecrated the temple. When they entered the city in triumph and cleansed the temple and rededicated it to God, the people had celebrated with palm branches. The palms, on that occasion, had been the symbol of a people reclaiming what was theirs, of freedom restored. So when the crowd spread palm branches before Jesus on that Sunday morning, they were reaching into all of this history at once. They were reaching back to the temple, to Sukkot, to the Maccabees, to the ancient language of Jewish celebration and longing and hope. They were wrapping their welcome in centuries of meaning. They may not have understood fully what they were doing. They may have been hoping for something different than what Jesus intended to give them. Many of them were hoping, perhaps, for a political deliverer, a revolutionary who would drive the Romans out the way the Maccabees had driven out the Seleucids, a king who would restore the nation of Israel to the glory it had known under David and Solomon. That was not what Jesus had come to do, and that gap between what the crowd hoped for and what Jesus actually was is one of the quiet tensions that runs beneath the surface of the entire Palm Sunday story like a deep current beneath still water. But their longing was not wrong. Their hope was not misplaced. They were right that something was being restored, right that something was being reclaimed, right that a king had arrived. They simply could not yet see the full shape of the kingdom he was bringing. A kingdom not measured in military victories or geographic borders, but in something far more vast and far more intimate. And so they did what human beings do when something moves them beyond their ability to fully understand it. They sang, they wept, they took off their cloaks and spread them on the road. They cut branches from the trees and waved them at the sky. They celebrated with everything they had, reaching toward something they could feel but not yet fully see. And Jesus, riding slowly toward them on a borrowed donkey, received their worship with the quiet dignity of someone who knew, far better than they did, exactly what it meant. The city of Jerusalem stretched out before him. The temple gleamed in the morning light, and the week that would change everything was just beginning. There is a kind of silence that is not empty. It is the silence that falls after something significant has happened, after the last note of a piece of music fades, after the final words of a long-awaited conversation, after a door closes on something you know will never be quite the same again. It is a silence full of weight and meaning and the particular heaviness of things that cannot be unsaid or undone. Jerusalem, in the days following that extraordinary Sunday, held that kind of silence. Not a peaceful silence, a watchful one. Jesus had entered the city. He had wept over it. He had cleansed the temple. He had healed the sick in the temple courts while children sang around him. And now, as Monday and Tuesday of that remarkable week unfolded, he continued to do what he had always done. He taught. He spoke in parables and answered questions and engaged with everyone who came to him, friend and foe alike, with the same unhurried, unfrightened steadiness. But the authorities were gathering, and the ground beneath the weak was beginning, slowly and inevitably, to shift. Before we follow those gathering shadows, though, there is a story from Monday of that week that deserves to be told. A quiet, strange little story that has puzzled and fascinated readers for 2,000 years. It is the story of the fig tree. On Monday morning, as Jesus made his way back into Jerusalem from Bethany, he was hungry. He saw a fig tree beside the road, covered in leaves, and he went to it looking for fruit. But there was no fruit on it, only leaves. And Jesus, in a moment that seems startling coming from a man who had wept with compassion over Jerusalem just the day before, spoke to the tree. He said, simply, "May you never bear fruit again." And the tree, Matthew tells us, withered immediately. The disciples were astonished. But this was not a moment of petulance or irritability. It was like so much of what Jesus did, a living parable, a thing enacted in the physical world to say something that mere words could not say as powerfully. The fig tree was full of the appearance of life, green and lush and leafy. But when you came close to it looking for what it was actually meant to produce, there was nothing there. It looked alive. It looked fruitful, but it was, in the deepest sense, barren. And Jesus, moving through a city that was full of religious activity, sacrifices being offered, prayers being recited, tithes being paid, festivals being observed, was asking a quiet, piercing question. Is all of this producing anything? Is there fruit here beneath all these leaves? Or is this, too, a tree that looks alive but has nothing to give? It was a question aimed not at the Roman occupiers or the ordinary people in the streets. It was aimed with surgical precision at the religious establishment, at the institution that had turned the house of prayer into a marketplace, at the leadership that was, even now, plotting against him not because he was wrong, but because he was dangerous to their power. The fig tree withered, and Jesus walked on into the city. Now, in these middle days of Holy Week, something remarkable happens in the gospel accounts. The religious leaders come to Jesus one after another, each with a question carefully designed to trap him, to make him say something that will discredit him with the crowds, or give the authorities grounds to arrest him, or force him into a politically impossible position. First come the chief priests and the elders, who challenge him directly. By what authority, they demand, do you do these things? Who gave you this authority? It was a reasonable question on its surface, but it was really a trap. If he claimed divine authority, they could accuse him of blasphemy. If he deflected, they could undermine his credibility with the crowds. Jesus, characteristically, answered their question with a question of his own. He asked them about John the Baptist. Was John's baptism from heaven or from men? And they found themselves caught in exactly the trap they had tried to set for him. If they said from heaven, Jesus would ask why they hadn't believed him. If they said from men, the crowds, who revered John as a prophet, would turn against them. So they said, simply, "We don't know." And Jesus said, "Then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." It was not evasion. It was something far more precise. He was showing them, and everyone watching, that their question was not an honest one. They were not asking because they genuinely wanted to know. They were asking because they wanted a weapon, and he would not hand them one. Then came the Pharisees, with perhaps the most famous trick question of the entire week. They sent their disciples along with members of the Herodian party, two groups who normally disagreed deeply with each other, united now in their shared desire to neutralize Jesus. And they asked him, "Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" This was a beautifully constructed trap. If Jesus said yes, pay the tax, he would alienate the Jewish nationalists and those who resented Roman occupation. And much of the crowd that had welcomed him so warmly on Sunday fell into that category. If he said no, don't pay the tax, he could be reported to the Roman authorities for inciting rebellion. Either answer seemed to cost him something significant. Jesus asked them to show him the coin used to pay the tax. They produced a denarius, a Roman silver coin bearing the image and inscription of Caesar Tiberius. And Jesus looked at it and asked them a question that has echoed through centuries of political and theological debate ever since. He said, "Whose image is this? Whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they told him. "Then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's," he said, "and give to God what is God's." The room, the gospel tells us, fell silent. They marveled, and they went away. It was not a dodge. It was a distinction, a recognition that human life operates in multiple spheres simultaneously, the civic and the sacred, and that the deepest obligations of a human being cannot be reduced to a tax question. There are things that bear Caesar's image, and there are things that bear God's image. And the most important question, the one hanging quietly in the air after Jesus spoke, was this: what bears God's image? The answer, of course, was not a coin. It was a person, every person, made, as the very first pages of Scripture declare, in the image and likeness of God. Give to God what is God's. And what is God's is everything that walks and breathes and carries within it the imprint of the divine. The Sadducees came next with a convoluted question about resurrection, which they themselves did not believe in, trying to make the concept seem absurd. And then a teacher of the law, perhaps more sincerely than the others, asked Jesus which was the greatest commandment. And here, in the midst of all this sparring and testing and trapping, Jesus gave an answer that was not a trap in return. It was simply the truth, stated plainly and beautifully. He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." The teacher who had asked the question recognized the wisdom of the answer. He said, "You're right. This is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And Jesus, looking at him, said something tender. "You are not far from the kingdom of God. Not far. Not there yet, perhaps, but moving in the right direction. Close enough to feel the warmth of it." These exchanges in the temple courts were not abstract theological debates. They were happening in public, in a city swollen with Passover pilgrims, in the shadow of an institution that felt its authority being quietly dismantled. Every question Jesus answered, every trap he stepped around, every moment he turned the conversation towards something deeper and truer. All of it was witnessed by crowds of ordinary people who had come to Jerusalem to remember their history and found themselves, instead, standing in the middle of something new being born. And through all of it, Jesus taught. He told parables about vineyards and wedding banquets and servants and masters. He spoke of a son who took his inheritance and wasted it in a far country. and of a father who ran toward him when he saw him returning. He spoke of seeds falling on different kinds of soil, some rocky, some thorny, some rich and deep and ready. He spoke of a treasure hidden in a field that a man sold everything he owned to purchase. These were not complicated stories. They were the stories of ordinary life, farming and family and money and loss and homecoming, lifted up and turned slightly, the way you might turn a piece of glass in the light, until something shone through them that you had not expected to see. He was teaching people how to see, how to look at the world they already lived in and find, woven through its everyday fabric, the threads of something eternal. And the people listened. They came in the morning and stayed through the heat of the day. They pressed in close and strained to hear. Luke's gospel tells us that all the people hung on his words, hung on them, as though the words themselves were something you could hold on to, something solid in the uncertain air of that week. Because the week was uncertain, anyone paying attention could feel it. The religious authorities were circling. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, had come to Jerusalem for Passover, as was his practice, to maintain order during the crowded, volatile festival season. There were always tensions during Passover. The story of Passover itself was a story of liberation from an occupying power, and that story, retold annually, had a way of stirring things in people that made Roman administrators nervous. Into all of this complexity, this tangle of religious and political and personal forces, Jesus moved with a stillness that was almost inexplicable. He did not seem hurried. He did not seem afraid. He answered questions and told stories and healed people and looked at the temple that he had cleansed and spoke of a day when not one stone of it would be left upon another. He knew where the week was going. He had known, the Gospels suggest, for a long time, and yet he stayed. This is perhaps one of the most quietly extraordinary things about the Palm Sunday story and the week it begins. Jesus was not trapped. He was not caught unaware. He was not a victim of circumstances that spiraled beyond his control. At any point, he could have withdrawn. He could have left Jerusalem, gone back north to Galilee, returned to the quieter rhythms of teaching by the lake. The crowds who loved him would have followed him anywhere. But he did not go. He stayed in Jerusalem. He returned each morning to the temple courts. He continued to teach and heal and engage, right in the center of the city where the forces gathering against him were most concentrated. He stayed because he had come to stay, because the week, with all its weight and all its darkness and all its pain, was not an interruption of his purpose. It was the fulfillment of it. Palm Sunday is the door through which Holy Week opens. It is the bright, celebratory threshold before the corridor of harder days. And understanding the joy of that Sunday, the palm branches, the singing, the children, the cloaks spread on the dusty road, requires holding it alongside the knowledge of what Jesus carried into the city with him. Not just his physical presence, not just his teaching and his healing, but his full and clear-eyed awareness of what love, taken all the way to its conclusion, would require of him. He rode it on a donkey, humble and unhurried. He wept over a city he loved. He cleared a temple that had forgotten what it was for. He answered his enemies with wisdom and his friends with tenderness. He taught every day in stories simple enough for a child to hear and deep enough to spend a lifetime inside. And in the evenings, he walked back out of Bethany to the hillside and the olive trees and the stars over Jerusalem, and he rested. The week was still young, and the story was moving slowly and surely toward the moment it had always been moving toward. There is something about the middle of a week that feels different from its beginning. At the start of something, a journey, a story, a season, there is the brightness of the threshold, the freshness of beginning. Everything is still possibility, still open, still lit with the particular glow of things not yet determined. And at the end of something, there is resolution, completion, the closing of a circle. But the middle is different. The middle is where the weight settles in, where the distance already traveled begins to make itself felt in your bones, and the distance still to go stretches out ahead in ways you cannot yet fully see. The middle is where the story gets serious. By Wednesday of Holy Week, Jesus and his disciples were in the middle, and the middle was growing heavier by the hour. We do not know a great deal about Wednesday of that week. The gospel accounts are quieter about this particular day than about the days surrounding it. Some scholars have suggested that Jesus may have rested, that after the intensity of Monday and Tuesday, the teaching and the confrontations and the long walks between Bethany and Jerusalem, this may have been a day of withdrawal and prayer and stillness, a gathering of breath before what was to come. And there is something right about that possibility. Every great story has its moments of quietness before the turning point. Every long journey has its places where the traveler stops and drinks from whatever water is near and looks at the sky and simply breathes. But before we rest in that Wednesday quiet, there is a story from the days just before it that deserves to be told with great care, because it is one of the most beautiful and most misunderstood stories of the entire Holy Week. It is the story of a woman and a jar of perfume, and an act so extravagant that it scandalized everyone in the room except the one person whose opinion actually mattered. The Gospels place this story in Bethany, that small village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives where Jesus had been staying each evening. The setting was the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a name that tells us something immediately, because lepers in that culture were not people you invited to dinner. They were considered ritually unclean, socially excluded, kept at a distance by religious law and social custom. The fact that Simon was hosting a dinner, the fact that Jesus was reclining at his table, tells you something about the kind of company Jesus kept and the kind of boundaries he was willing to cross. While Jesus was at the table, a woman came in. She was carrying an alabaster jar, a small, elegant flask made of a soft white stone that was used to store precious liquids. Inside the jar was perfume made from nard, also called spikenard, an aromatic oil extracted from a plant that grew in the mountains of northern India. It had to travel an enormous distance to reach Palestine, and that journey was reflected in its price. The Gospel of Mark tells us that the perfume was worth more than 300 denarii, roughly a year's wages for an ordinary working person. This was not a small luxury. This was something of tremendous value. The woman broke the jar open, broke it, so there was no possibility of holding anything back, no possibility of using only a little and saving the rest, and she poured the entire contents over the head of Jesus. The room reacted immediately. The disciples were indignant. They said, among themselves and perhaps out loud, "Why this waste? This perfume could have been sold for a great deal of money and given to the poor." It was not an unreasonable objection. It was, on the surface, a sensible one. 300 denarii could feed a great many hungry people. But Jesus stopped them. He said, gently but firmly, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." For burial. In a room full of people eating dinner, in the warm lamplight of a home in Bethany, with the smell of nard filling every corner of the space, Jesus named what the woman had done. She had anointed him, not for kingship, though anointing was the act that set a king apart, and the very word Messiah means anointed one. She had anointed him for burial, for death, for what was coming at the end of the week. Whether she fully understood what she was doing is a question the Gospels leave open. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she had been listening more carefully than the disciples, hearing in Jesus' words things they had not wanted to hear. Perhaps her act was conscious and prophetic and deliberate, a farewell gift offered with full knowledge of what it meant. Or perhaps she simply loved him, with the uncomplicated and extravagant love that sometimes bypasses the careful calculations of the mind and goes straight to the truth of a thing. Perhaps she knew, the way you sometimes know something in your body before your mind is caught up, that this was the moment, that he needed this. That was time. Either way, Jesus received it as one of the most significant acts anyone had offered him, and he said something remarkable about it. He said, "Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." He gave her a kind of immortality in that moment. This unnamed woman, we do not know her name in Matthew and Mark's accounts, though John's gospel identifies her as Mary, the sister of Lazarus. This woman who broke open her most precious possession and poured it out without reservation would be remembered as long as the story of Jesus was told. And here we are, 2,000 years later, still telling it. The act of anointing runs very deep in the story of Palm Sunday and Holy Week. To anoint was to consecrate, to set apart for a sacred purpose. Kings were anointed, priests were anointed. In the Hebrew scriptures, the act of anointing was the moment when an ordinary person was marked out as belonging to something larger than themselves, given over to a purpose that would define everything that followed. And here, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman with a broken jar and a year's worth of wages poured out in a moment, she performed that consecration. She marked him. She set him apart, not for a throne in the conventional sense, for something that looked from the outside like defeat, but was, in the understanding of the Christian faith, the greatest victory in human history. The fragrance of that nard, the Gospels suggest, would have lingered on his hair, on his clothing, following him through the days that remained. An invisible marker, a reminder, perhaps, in the difficult hours ahead, that he had been loved, extravagantly, unreservedly, beautifully loved. Now let us speak for a moment about the disciples, because they are present throughout this entire story, through the palm branches and the temple clearing and the teaching and the dinner in Bethany, and they are, in many ways, the most human figures in it, the most recognizably, achingly human. They had been with Jesus for 3 years. 3 years of walking with him through the towns and villages of Galilee and Judea. 3 years of watching him heal the sick and feed the hungry and still the storms and raise the dead. 3 years of listening to his teaching, sitting with his parables, trying to understand what he meant when he spoke of the kingdom of God. 3 years of believing, in their own imperfect and wavering way, that he was who they thought he was. And yet, throughout Holy Week, the Gospels show us disciples who are frequently confused, frequently missing the point, arguing among themselves about who would be the greatest in the kingdom, falling asleep when Jesus needed them to stay awake, reaching for swords when swords were not the answer, running away when a moment of crisis came. They are not heroes in this story, at least not yet. They are people who loved imperfectly and understood incompletely, and whose courage failed them at the worst possible moment. People who were, in other words, very much like us. And this is one of the most quietly comforting things about the Holy Week story. The people who were closest to Jesus, who had seen the most, who had heard the most, who had been given every possible reason to understand, were still fumbling in the dark much of the time, still getting it wrong, still letting their fear override their faith. If the disciples, with all that proximity and all that first-hand experience, could be that confused and that frightened, then perhaps our own confusion and fear are not disqualifying. Perhaps they are simply part of what it means to be human, walking through a story whose full shape we cannot yet see. There is one disciple, though, whose story takes a particularly dark turn during these middle days of Holy Week, and we cannot tell the Palm Sunday story honestly without acknowledging him. His name was Judas Iscariot. Judas was one of the 12, one of the inner circle who had walked with Jesus from the earliest days of his ministry. He served as the keeper of the group's common purse, the one responsible for managing whatever funds the disciples had. He had been present for everything. He had heard every teaching. He had seen every miracle. And somewhere in the course of Holy Week, the Gospels differ slightly on the precise timing, but most place it in these middle days. Judas went to the chief priests. He went to the very people who were plotting against Jesus, and he asked them a question that has haunted history ever since. "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" They offered him 30 pieces of silver, the price, some scholars note, of a slave in ancient Israel, a detail that carries its own quiet weight. And Judas accepted, and from that moment, the Gospel of Matthew tells us, he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over. Why did Judas do it? People have been asking that question for 2,000 years. The Gospels themselves offer different hints without ever providing tidy answer. Some suggest it was greed, and his reaction to the expensive perfume, his protest about it being wasted, lends some support to this. The Gospel of John states bluntly that Judas used to help himself to the money in the common purse, that he was a thief. Luke and John both say that Satan entered into him, a way of expressing, in the language of that era, that something had taken hold of him that was darker and more powerful than ordinary human weakness. But perhaps the most honest answer is that we do not fully know. And perhaps that is precisely the point. Judas is not a cartoon villain. He is not an outsider who crept into the story to do damage from the outside. He was an insider. He was trusted. He was known. He sat at the same table, ate the same bread, heard the same teachings as everyone else. And he made a choice that could not be unmade. The betrayal of Judas is one of the deepest shadows that falls across the brightness of Palm Sunday. On Sunday, the crowd sang and waved their branches. By Wednesday, one of the 12 was already meeting with enemies. The distance between those two moments, between the singing and the silver, is a distance that runs right through the middle of human nature. The capacity for worship and the capacity for betrayal. The longing for the sacred and the willingness to sell it. Both things present, sometimes in the same heart. And yet the story does not end with Judas and his 30 pieces of silver. It does not end in the darkness of that meeting with the chief priests. It keeps moving, as all true stories do, towards something the darkness cannot contain. Thursday was coming, and with Thursday, the most intimate evening of the entire week. A room, an upper floor, a table set for 13, bread and wine, a basin of water and a towel. Words spoken so carefully and so lovingly that they have been repeated, in one form or another, in Christian communities around the world every week since, for 2,000 years and counting. The week was moving toward its center. The weight was gathering. The story was deepening. And Jesus, who had ridden in on a donkey on Sunday morning with the sound of singing all around him, continued to move through it all with the same unhurried, unfrightened grace, teaching when there was someone to teach, resting when rest was needed, preparing, in ways both visible and invisible, for what only he fully understood was coming. The palm branches were dry now, lying somewhere at the side of the road where they had been dropped after the procession. The singing had faded. The city was watching and waiting, as cities do, for whatever came next. And in the quiet of the olive groves outside Bethany, beneath the same stars that had looked down on Jerusalem for 1,000 years, the story breathed and gathered itself and moved on. There's a kind of evening that feels different from all the others. Not the bright, easy evenings of ordinary days, when the light fades slowly and the world settles into its familiar rhythms of rest and quiet, but the kind of evening that carries something in it, a weight, a significance, the kind of evening that, even as you are living through it, some part of you knows you will never forget. Thursday evening of Holy Week was that kind of evening. Jesus had sent 2 of his disciples ahead into the city with instructions that, by now, will sound familiar because they echo the instructions he had given before the Palm Sunday procession. He told them to go into Jerusalem and that they would meet a man carrying a jar of water. They were to follow him, and he would lead them to a house. And they would tell the owner of the house that the teacher was asking where the guest room was, where he could eat the Passover meal with his disciples. And the owner would show them a large upper room, already furnished and ready. Again, it happened exactly as he said. The room was found. The preparations were made. And as evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12, and they reclined at the table together. This meal has become one of the most painted, most written about, most contemplated scenes in all of human history. Leonardo da Vinci spent 3 years painting it on the wall of the Milan dining hall in the late 15th century. Theologians have written libraries of books about it. Christians around the world reenact it every time they gather for what they call communion, or the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, different names for the same sacred remembrance. It has been at the center of Christian worship for 2,000 years. And yet when you read the gospel accounts of that evening carefully, what strikes you most is not its grandeur. It is its intimacy. It is how small it was. 13 people in a borrowed room, a table with food and wine, the city of Jerusalem humming outside the windows with Passover activity. And in the room, something so quiet and so tender that it barely seems to belong to the same week as the temple clearing and the theological debates and the plots forming in the shadows. Before the meal even properly began, Jesus did something that stopped everyone in the room. He got up from the table. He took off his outer robe. He tied a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin, and he began, one by one, to wash his disciples' feet. In the first century world, this was not a neutral act. Foot washing was the work of the lowest servant in a household, the one at the very bottom of the social order. Guests arriving at a home after a journey on dusty roads would have their feet washed, but it was not the host who did it. It was a servant, a slave, someone whose entire social position was defined by their willingness to perform the tasks that no one else wanted to perform. And here was Jesus, the one they called Rabbi, Teacher, Lord, the Son of David, the one for whom they had watched crowds spread cloaks on the road and wave palm branches just 4 days earlier, kneeling on the floor of an upper room with a basin of water and a towel, washing the road dust from his disciples' feet. Peter, characteristically, cannot bear it. When Jesus came to him, Peter pulled his feet back and said, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus told him that he did not understand now what was happening, but that he would understand later. Peter said, with the particular fierceness of someone who loves deeply and therefore protests loudly, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." At which point Peter swung entirely to the other extreme, as Peter so often did, and said, "Then not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus smiled at this, or at least one imagines he did, and told Peter that someone who is bathed only needs their feet washed. The rest of them is clean. When he had finished, and returned his place at the table, Jesus explained what he had done. He said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." The kingdom he had been teaching about all week, in parables and answers and exchanges in the temple courts, was demonstrated in that upper room not through a speech or a doctrine, but through a basin of water and a towel. "The greatest among you," he had said more than once during his ministry, "will be your servant." And here, on the night before his death, he enacted that teaching in the most physical and unmistakable way he could. He knelt down. He took their feet in his hands. He washed them. Even the Gospel of John makes clear the feet of Judas. He knew. John's Gospel tells us explicitly that by this point in the evening, Jesus was fully aware that Judas had already made his arrangement with the chief priests. He knew that one of the men whose feet he was washing had already accepted 30 pieces of silver to hand him over to his enemies. And he washed his feet anyway, gently, completely, without accusation or anger, with the same care he gave to everyone else in the room. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail of the entire Last Supper account. The betrayer's feet, washed by the hands of the one he was betraying. It is an act so far beyond ordinary human capacity for forgiveness and generosity that it stops the breath. And then, during the meal itself, Jesus told them, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples were devastated, confused. They began to look at one another, asking, "Lord, is it I?" Each one of them, uncertain enough about their own hearts, honest enough about their own weakness, turned the question on themselves first. Is it me? Could it be me? John's Gospel tells us that Peter leaned over to the disciple sitting closest to Jesus, traditionally identified as John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and whispered to him to ask Jesus who it was. And that disciple leaned back toward Jesus and quietly asked, and Jesus answered, just as quietly, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." He dipped the bread. He gave it to Judas. And John writes that after Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, "What you are about to do, do quickly." And Judas went out into the night. Into the night. Those three words carry an enormous weight in John's Gospel, which has been using the imagery of light and darkness throughout. Judas stepped out of the lamplight of the upper room and into the darkness of the Jerusalem streets, moving toward the priests, moving toward the soldiers, moving toward the garden where he knew Jesus would go to pray. The door closed behind him, and the 11 who remained drew a little closer together around the table. What followed in that upper room, in the hours after Judas left, is at the very heart of what Christians call the gospel. The good news, the thing the whole story has been moving toward. Jesus took bread. He gave thanks for it. He broke it, as the woman had broken her alabaster jar, so that what was inside could be poured out completely. And he gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup of wine. He gave thanks. He passed it to them and said, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." These words were spoken in the middle of the Passover meal, the meal that commemorated the Exodus, the night the lamb was slaughtered and its blood marked the doorposts, and the angel of death passed over. Jesus was not speaking in a vacuum. He was speaking into a story his disciples had known since childhood, a story soaked in the imagery of sacrifice and deliverance and blood and freedom. And he was telling them that the story was not finished. That had been all along, pointing toward this moment. toward him, the bread and the wine, the body and the blood. The covenant, that ancient word for a binding, unbreakable promise between God and humanity, renewed and deepened and fulfilled in the person sitting at the head of the table in a borrowed room in Jerusalem on a Thursday night. Christians have been breaking bread and sharing wine in memory of that evening ever since, in grand cathedrals and in simple village chapels, in underground churches in countries where faith is dangerous, in hospital rooms and prison cells and living rooms and on the decks of ships in the middle of the ocean. The form changes, the language changes. The setting is almost never an upper room in Jerusalem, but the act is the same. The remembrance is the same. The words, repeated across 2,000 years in hundreds of languages, are the same. This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. After the meal, John's Gospel gives us something extraordinary. 5 full chapters of conversation between Jesus and his disciples in that upper room, a farewell discourse of such depth and tenderness that readers have been returning to it for 2,000 years and still finding new things inside it. He spoke to them about going away and coming back, about the rooms he was going to prepare for them, about the Holy Spirit, whom he called the Comforter, the Advocate, who would come to be with them after he was gone, about peace, his peace, which he said was different from the peace the world gives, about love, that they should love one another as he had loved them, about the vine and the branches, about how apart from him they could do nothing, but connected to him they could bear fruit that would last. He prayed for them. John chapter 17 is one of the most intimate prayers in all of Scripture. Jesus speaking directly to God, not performing for the crowd, not teaching for the disciples' benefit, but simply talking to his Father about the people he loved. He prayed that they would be protected, that they would be unified, that the love with which God had loved him would be in them. He prayed, remarkably, not just for the 11 in the room. He prayed for all those who would believe through their message. Every person in every generation who would hear this story and find something true in it, he was praying for them too, in that upper room, on that Thursday night. Which means, if you're listening to this story right now and finding something in it that moves you or stirs you or makes you want to lean in a little closer, he was praying for you. 2,000 years before you were born, in a borrowed room in a city on the other side of the world, you were included in that prayer. And then the evening was over. The meal was finished. The prayers had been spoken. They sang a hymn together, one last song in the lamplight of the upper room, and then they went out into the night, down through the darkened streets of Jerusalem, down through the Kidron Valley, where a small seasonal stream ran between the city and the Mount of Olives, and up the other side to a garden called Gethsemane. The name Gethsemane means oil press. It was a garden of olive trees, old ones, the kind whose gnarled and ancient trunks suggest centuries of standing in the same place, witnessing the seasons turn and the city beyond the valley rise and fall and rise again. Olive trees can live for 1,000 years. The trees in Gethsemane on that Thursday night may have been old even then. Jesus asked his disciples to sit and wait while he went further into the garden to pray. He took Peter and James and John with him, the same 3 who had been with him on the mountain when he had been transfigured, when his face had shone like the sun and his clothes had become dazzling white. The 3 who had seen the most. He asked them to keep watch with him, and then he went a little further, and he knelt, and he prayed the most human prayer of his entire ministry. He said, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The cup, the weight of what was coming, the full, terrible, human reality of it. And in that prayer, spoken alone among the olive trees while his disciples slept nearby, We see something that the palm branches and the singing and the teaching in the temple courts had not shown us quite so clearly. We see that the courage of Jesus was not the courage of someone who felt no fear. It was the courage of someone who felt it fully, who asked, honestly and without pretense, if there was another way, and then chose, in full knowledge, to go forward anyway. Not my will, yours. He went back to his disciples. They were asleep. He woke them, gently, and asked them to watch and pray. He went away a second time and prayed the same prayer. He returned and found them sleeping again, for their eyes, Luke tells us, were heavy with grief. He left them and prayed a third time. 3 times he prayed. 3 times he returned to find them sleeping. And then, on the third return, he looked at them with something that the Gospels describe not as anger, but as a kind of gentle, clear-eyed acceptance. And he said, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And even as he spoke, the light of torches appeared at the edge of the garden. The sound of footsteps, soldiers and officials, and, at their head, carrying no weapon, needing none, Judas Iscariot. The Garden of Gethsemane was about to become the place where the brightness of Palm Sunday met the darkness of what the week had always been moving toward. But even here, even now, the story was not out of control. It was not spiraling into chaos. It was unfolding, step by deliberate step, exactly as it needed to, as it had always been meant to. The torches came closer, the disciples stirred, and Jesus stood up and walked toward what was coming. There are moments in a story when everything changes, not gradually, not with the slow, almost imperceptible shifting that characterizes most of life. The way a season turns, or a relationship deepens, or a person grows older. But suddenly, with the particular sharpness of a door closing, or a word spoken that cannot be taken back, or a light going out in a room that was warm just a moment before. The arrival of torches in the Garden of Gethsemane was one of those moments. Judas led them there because he knew the place. John's Gospel tells us that Jesus had often gone to that garden with his disciples. It was a place of retreat, of prayer, of quiet, a place Judas had been many times himself. And he used that knowledge now in the darkest way knowledge can be used. He used the intimacy of shared memory to find the person he had agreed to betray. The group that came into the garden was substantial. John's Gospel uses the word for a Roman cohort, which in its full form numbered several hundred soldiers, along with officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They came with torches and lanterns and weapons. A significant force, armed and organized, sent in the middle of the night to arrest one man and 11 frightened disciples. And Judas had told them beforehand how they would know which one was Jesus in the darkness of the garden. He had arranged a signal. He said, "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." He walked up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. In that culture, as in many cultures, a kiss was a greeting of warmth and respect between close friends. It was the greeting of someone who belonged, someone trusted, someone loved. And Judas took that gesture, that particular gesture of intimacy and affection, and turned it into the mechanism of betrayal. Jesus looked at him, and what he said, depending on which gospel account you read, was either a question, "Friend, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" or simply the word, "friend." Some translations render it as companion. The Greek word is heteros, not the deepest word for friend in the Greek language, but a word of association, of having walked together, of shared history. Even now, even in this moment, friend, Peter, predictably and heartbreakingly, reached for a sword. He struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. And Jesus, in what must be one of the most remarkable moments of the entire week, stopped everything. He told Peter to put the sword away, and then he reached out and healed the man's ear, the ear of someone who had come to arrest him, healed in the garden, in the torchlight, in the middle of his own arrest. Even here, even now, he healed. He said to the crowd that came for him, "Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all happened so that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." And then the disciples ran, all of them. They scattered into the darkness of the garden and the olive trees and the night, leaving Jesus standing alone among the soldiers and the torches. The ones who had argued about who would be greatest in the kingdom. The ones who had promised, just hours earlier at the table, that they would never abandon him. They ran. Only Jesus remained, and he went with the soldiers, willingly, into the city. What followed through the rest of that night and into the morning is a series of trials. Hasty, irregular, conducted in the dark hours when most of Jerusalem was sleeping and unable to witness what was happening. Jesus was taken first to Annas, a former high priest who still wielded enormous influence. Then to Caiaphas, the current high priest, where the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, had assembled in the middle of the night to question him. It was here, in the courtyard of the high priest's house, that Peter's story took its own dark turn. Peter had not run as far as the others. He had followed, at a distance, and found his way into the courtyard where people were gathered around a fire in the cold night air. And 3 times, once to a servant girl, once to another bystander, once to a group standing nearby, someone recognized him as a follower of Jesus. And 3 times Peter denied it. Denied knowing him, denied having anything to do with him. The 3rd time, as the words were still leaving his mouth, a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered. He remembered that Jesus, at the table just hours before, had told him this would happen, had said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter had protested loudly that he would die before he let that happen. Luke's gospel adds a detail that is almost unbearable in its tenderness. It says that at the moment the rooster crowed, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Just looked at him, from across the courtyard, in the firelight. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Inside, the trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin was reaching its conclusion. They had been trying to find witnesses whose testimony could provide legal grounds for a death sentence, and the witnesses they found contradicted each other. Finally, Caiaphas asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered, for perhaps the first time with complete and unambiguous directness, in front of the highest religious authority in Judaism, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his robes, the traditional gesture of hearing blasphemy, and the council condemned him as worthy of death. And now, as Friday morning arrived and the city of Jerusalem began to wake and the Passover week continued around them, let us pause for a moment in this story, because this is precisely the right moment to talk about something we have been carrying through the entire narrative, something that began on Sunday morning with the road and the crowds and the celebration, and that deserves to be understood more fully now that we have traveled so far into the week. Let's talk about the palm branches, and about why this day is called Palm Sunday, and about what those leaves, waved by ordinary people on a dusty road outside Jerusalem, actually meant and still mean. The palm tree itself is one of the oldest symbols in human civilization. Long before the 1st century, long before Jesus rode toward Jerusalem, The palm had been woven into the fabric of how human beings understood honor, victory, and the sacred. In the ancient world, palm branches were awarded to victorious athletes at the games. The original Olympic winners did not receive gold medals. They received palms. The Romans used palm imagery on their coins and in their triumphal art to signify conquest and glory. To hold a palm branch was to hold a symbol of winning, of overcoming, of something difficult having been endured and transcended. In the Jewish tradition, as we touched on earlier in our story, palms had an even deeper resonance. They were one of the 4 species, along with myrtle, willow, and the etrog, a citrus fruit, used in the celebration of Sukkot, the festival of tabernacles. The Torah commanded that these branches be taken up and waved before the Lord as an act of worship and thanksgiving, and specifically during the Howl, the great psalms of praise sung at festival times, Psalms 113 through 118. The people would wave their palm branches at the words Hosanna. Hosanna, save us now. So when the crowd cut branches from the palm trees and waved them on that Sunday morning, they were not inventing something new. They were reaching into the deepest ritual memory of their faith. They were performing an act of worship that their grandparents and great-grandparents had performed that stretched back through centuries of Jewish festival observance. They were saying with their hands and their branches and their voices the same thing their ancestors had said every year at Sukkot. Hosanna, save us now. And they were directing it at Jesus, identifying him, consciously or instinctively, as the one in whom their deepest prayers for salvation were being answered. The palm branch, in Christian understanding, carries all of this forward and adds another layer. In the book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian Bible, a text written in the apocalyptic tradition and filled with vivid and layered imagery, there is a vision of a great multitude standing before the throne of God. They are described as coming from every nation and tribe and people and language, and they are holding palm branches, white robes and palm branches, the language of victory and worship in the presence of the divine. The palm branch became, in Christian tradition, the symbol of the martyr, the one who had endured suffering and death for the faith and had come through it into something that suffering and death could not touch. Saints in Christian art are often depicted holding palms. It was the marker of someone who had followed Jesus, not just on the easy road, but all the way to the end of the hardest one. Someone who had chosen faithfulness over safety, love over self-preservation, eternity over the comfortable arrangements of the moment. And so the palm branch holds, in a single image, both the joy of Sunday morning and the suffering of Friday afternoon, both the singing crowd and the silent tomb, both the triumphant entry and the cost of what that entry ultimately meant. It is a symbol wide enough to hold the entire arc of Holy Week in its fronds, from the brightness of the beginning to the darkness of the middle to the unimaginable light of what came after. This is why, in churches around the world, every year on the Sunday before Easter, people hold palm branches. Or, in places where palms do not grow, olive branches, or simple crosses woven from palm leaves distributed at the door. They are doing what the crowd on the road did. They are naming Jesus as the one who comes in the name of the Lord. They are saying, Hosanna, save us now. They are taking up the ancient gesture of worship and victory and pressing it into the hands of this particular story. In many churches, the palms used on Palm Sunday are collected at the end of the service and saved. They are dried through the year, and then, on the following Ash Wednesday, the beginning of the next Lent, they are burned. And the ash from those burned palms is mixed with oil, and it is that ash that the priest or minister uses to mark the foreheads of the faithful with a cross, saying, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." The palm of celebration becomes the ash of mortality. The joy of Sunday becomes the solemnity of Ash Wednesday. The whole cycle, praise and suffering and death and the hope of resurrection, contained in a single leaf cut from a tree on a road outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. It is a remarkable thing when you hold it all together. And now, as morning light fell over Jerusalem on that Friday and the trials moved toward their conclusion, the palm branches were somewhere at the side of the road where they had been dropped 5 days before. Dry now, beginning to curl at the edges. The crowds that had waved them were waking to an ordinary Passover Friday, not yet knowing what was being decided in the house of the high priest and in the halls of Roman power. Jesus was brought to Pontius Pilate. The Roman governor was the only one with the authority to impose a death sentence. The Jewish authorities could condemn, but only Rome could execute. Pilate questioned him, found him not guilty of any Roman crime, tried several times to release him. He sent him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee who happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover, hoping to pass the decision along. Herod sent him back. Pilate offered the crowd a choice. It was his custom at Passover to release one prisoner as a gesture of goodwill. He offered them Jesus, or a man named Barabbas, who had been imprisoned for insurrection and murder. The crowd chose Barabbas, and the crowd that 5 days earlier had cried Hosanna, save now cried something else entirely. Crucify him! Crucify him! Whether this was the same crowd is a question historians and theologians debate. Jerusalem was full of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The crowd at Pilate's gate on Friday morning may have been a very different gathering from the pilgrims who had lined the road on Sunday, perhaps specifically gathered and stirred by the chief priests and their allies, as Matthew's gospel suggests. The people who had spread their cloaks on the road may have been, at that same hour, somewhere else in the city, waking to their Passover morning without knowing what was happening in the governor's courtyard. We do not know. The Gospels do not tell us. What they tell us is that Pilate, in the end, gave the crowd what they demanded. He washed his hands, literally, publicly, with water brought to him in a basin, and declared himself innocent of this man's blood. And he handed Jesus over to be crucified. The story was in its darkest hour now. The week that had begun with singing was moving toward silence. The king who had ridden in on a donkey, humble and unhurried, was being led out of the city carrying a cross. But here's what the palm branch knows, what it has always known, what was cut from its tree to say, this is not the end of the story. It never was. The very symbol the crowd chose to welcome him, the symbol of victory, of overcoming, of something endured and transcended, was pointing, even then, beyond the darkness of Friday to something that no tomb could hold. The palm branch was right all along. It just had further to travel than anyone in the crowd on Sunday morning had imagined. There is a hill outside Jerusalem. It sits just beyond the city walls, close enough to the main road that travelers passing by would see what happened there. Close enough to the city that the sounds of the marketplace and the temple and the ordinary life of Jerusalem would have drifted up on the breeze. It was not a remote place, not hidden away in some quiet valley where difficult things could be done without witnesses. It was visible, public, deliberately so. The Romans understood the power of visibility. Crucifixion was not simply an execution method. It was a message, a demonstration of what happened to those who challenged the order of things, who disturbed the peace that Rome imposed, who made themselves inconvenient to the machinery of empire. The crosses were placed where people would see them, where travelers would pass and look and understand, without anyone needing to say a word, that this was the cost of defiance. The hill was called Golgotha. In Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, the word means the place of the skull. In Latin, it became Calvary, the word that has carried the weight of that hill through 2,000 years of Christian memory. It was here, on this hill, on a Friday morning in the spring, that Jesus was crucified. We will not dwell long in the physical details of crucifixion. They are known, and they are brutal, and they do not need to be rehearsed at length to be understood. What matters for our story is not the mechanics of the execution, but the meaning that the Christian faith is found in it. The extraordinary, counterintuitive, world-reversing meaning that has made this particular death the most written about, most contemplated, most transformative death in human history. Above the cross, Pilate had ordered a sign to be placed. It was the Roman custom to post the charge against the condemned, the crime for which they were being executed. And Pilate, perhaps with a weariness or a dry irony, or perhaps with some flicker of genuine belief, wrote, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so that everyone passing by could read it, regardless of where they had come from. The chief priests objected. They went to Pilate and said, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." They wanted the title to be a claim, not a declaration. They wanted a question mark where Pilate had put a period. Pilate, who had been pushed and maneuvered throughout the entire proceedings in ways that clearly frustrated him, said simply, "What I have written, I have written." And so above the cross, in 3 languages, the declaration remained, "King." On Sunday morning, the crowd had called him the Son of David. They had waved their palms and spread their cloaks and cried Hosanna to their king. On Friday, a Roman governor, reluctantly, almost accidentally, certainly without intending any theological profundity, wrote the same title in 3 languages and nailed it above the place where that king was dying. The soldiers who carried out the crucifixion divided his garments among them, casting lots for his seamless robe rather than tearing it. Fulfilling, the Gospel of John notes, the words of Psalm 22, written 1,000 years before, "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." The connections between the ancient writings and this present moment were everywhere, threaded through the day like a pattern that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole cloth. 2 other men were crucified alongside Jesus that day. Criminals, the Gospels call them, though the Greek word can also mean rebels or insurgents. One of them joined in the mocking that came from the crowd below and from the religious leaders who passed by, taunting Jesus, telling him to save himself if he really was who he claimed to be. "Save yourself. Come down from the cross." But the other criminal said something different. He rebuked the first, saying, "Don't you fear God? We are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then he turned to Jesus, dying in agony on a cross, and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." When you come into your kingdom. Not if, when. Even here on Golgotha, on a Friday afternoon, this man saw what the religious authorities had refused to see. Saw the king through the suffering. Saw the kingdom through the cross. And Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Today, not eventually, not after a long process of proving yourself worthy. Today, the word fell like light into a very dark place. There were women present at the cross. While the male disciples had scattered in the garden, the women had not run. Mary Magdalene was there. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And according to John's Gospel, standing at the foot of the cross was Mary, the mother of Jesus herself, alongside the disciple whom Jesus loved. When Jesus saw his mother standing there, with John beside her, he spoke to them both. He said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And to John, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, John tells us, that disciple took her into his own home. Even in his final hours, Jesus was arranging for the care of the people he loved. Even here, even now, he was thinking not of himself, but of others, making sure his mother would not be left alone, binding together, in a new kind of family, the people who would carry this story forward. The hours on the cross were long. The Gospels record 7 things Jesus said from the cross, traditionally called the 7 last words, though they are sentences rather than single words. And together they form a kind of final teaching, a last testament spoken from the place of deepest suffering. He prayed for the soldiers who had crucified him. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He spoke to the dying criminal beside him. He made provision for his mother. At some point, he cried out the opening words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry from the depths of human desolation that has comforted countless people across the centuries who have found themselves in their own moments of abandonment and darkness. He said, "I am thirsty." He said, "It is finished." And finally, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It is finished. The Greek word used is tetelestai, a single word that carries layers of meaning. It was the word written across a debt when it had been paid in full. It was the word an artist might speak when the final brushstroke was complete. It was not the word of someone defeated. It was the word of someone who had accomplished exactly what they came to accomplish, down to the last detail, with nothing left undone. And then he died. The gospel accounts describe what happened in the moments after his death with a kind of breathless accumulation of events that suggests the world itself responded to what had just occurred. The curtain in the temple, the great, thick curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary where God's presence dwelt, the place no ordinary person could enter, tore in two, from top to bottom, as though it had been opened from the inside. The earth shook, rocks split, tombs broke open. The Roman centurion who had overseen the crucifixion, a soldier, a man of Rome, a man whose entire career had been built on the machinery of empire and its power, stood at the foot of the cross and said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." A Roman soldier at Golgotha, saying what Pilate's sign had written and what the crowd on Sunday had sung and what the disciples had believed and doubted and believed again. Surely this man was the Son of God. Because Friday is part of the Palm Sunday story, it must be. You cannot tell the story of the king's arrival without telling what his kingdom cost him. You cannot wave the palm branches honestly without knowing where the road they lined was leading. The joy of Sunday morning and the grief of Friday afternoon are not separate stories. They are one story, told in 2 movements, like a piece of music that descends into its deepest and most dissonant notes before resolving into something that could not have been reached any other way. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Jewish council who had been a secret disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate gave his permission. Joseph and Nicodemus, another council member who had come to Jesus secretly once at night and asked him about being born again, wrapped the body in linen cloths with spices, 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, John tells us, a king's burial, and they placed him in a new tomb cut from rock in a garden near Golgotha. The stone was rolled across the entrance. The women who had followed from Galilee sat nearby and watched, and the Sabbath, which began at sunset on Friday, settled over Jerusalem like a held breath. Saturday was silence. There is no account of what happened on that Saturday. No gospel writer describes it. The disciples were behind locked doors. The Gospel of John tells us, for fear of the Jewish authorities. The women prepared spices and perfumes for anointing the body, and then rested, as the law required, on the Sabbath. The city went about its Passover observance. The temple continued its sacrifices. The Roman soldiers kept their watch. And in the garden, the stone was in its place, and the silence was complete. This Saturday silence is its own kind of theology. It is the silence of not yet, of waiting without knowing what you're waiting for, of grief that has not yet found its resolution, of faith that has nothing to hold on to except the memory of what it once believed. Many people live in this Saturday silence for long stretches of their lives. They have known the joy of Sunday, some moment of encounter, of belief, of feeling the presence of something larger and more loving than they had imagined possible. And they have passed through their own version of Friday: loss, disappointment, suffering, the death of something they had trusted. And they are in Saturday, waiting, not knowing if Sunday is coming. The disciples were there, in the locked room, in the dark, with the memory of the garden and the trials and the cross and the stone. They were in Saturday, and then the first day of the week came, early, before the sun had fully risen. While it was still dark, John says, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and the stone had been moved away from the entrance. She ran. She found Peter and John and told them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Peter and John ran to the tomb. John, the younger, outran Peter and arrived first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Peter arrived, breathing hard, and went straight in. He saw the linen cloths, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, not lying with the other cloths, but folded up, set carefully to one side by itself. Folded, set aside, as though someone had gotten up, unhurried, and simply left. The disciples went back to where they were staying, confused, wondering, turning over what they had seen. But Mary stayed at the tomb, standing outside, weeping, and she stooped down and looked into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seated where the body of Jesus had been. They asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." And then she turned, and there was someone standing there. She thought, through her tears, that it was the gardener. She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And he said her name, just her name, Mary, and she knew. She turned and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," teacher. This is the first Easter morning. This is the moment the story had been moving toward from the very beginning, from before the palm branches and the donkey and the road outside Jerusalem, from before the prophecy of Zechariah, from before the Psalms of David, from before the Passover lamb and the blood on the doorposts, and the night the slaves walked free. All of it, the entire long story of God and humanity, of promise and covenant and longing and hope, had been moving toward this garden. This morning, this woman standing in the early light, hearing her name spoken by someone she had thought was dead. He was not dead. He was risen. And the word she carried back to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," was the word that changed everything. The word that turned frightened people hiding in a locked room into the founders of a movement that would spread across the known world within a generation. The word that has been carried forward through 2,000 years of human history, through empires rising and falling, through centuries of change and upheaval, through every kind of suffering and joy that the human story contains. I have seen the Lord. This is why the palm branches matter. This is why that Sunday morning on the road outside Jerusalem was not simply a pleasant moment of popular enthusiasm that ended badly a few days later. The resurrection is the vindication of everything the crowd instinctively reached for when they cut their branches and spread their cloaks and cried Hosanna. They were right. He was the king. He did bring salvation. The kingdom he was inaugurating was real, and more vast, and more enduring than anything they had imagined when they waved their palms and hoped for a political deliverer. He delivered something far greater than a nation from an occupation. He delivered humanity from the deepest occupation of all, the occupation of fear and death, and the sense that the darkness is the final word on any of our stories. The palm branch, waved on Sunday morning, was waved again in the book of Revelation by the great multitude standing before the throne. The same gesture, the same meaning. Victory, overcoming, something endured and transcended. The crowd on the road was, without fully knowing it, performing a gesture that belonged to eternity. And so when Christians around the world gather on Palm Sunday every year, they are doing something layered and rich and worth understanding. They are remembering a historical moment, a specific morning on a specific road outside a specific city 2,000 years ago. They are participating in a gesture that stretches back through Jewish festival tradition into the deepest roots of how human beings have expressed worship and honor and joy. They are holding together the brightness of Sunday and the weight of the week that followed, because you cannot have Easter without Good Friday, and you cannot fully appreciate Good Friday without the hope that Palm Sunday plants in the ground like a seed. They are saying, with a leaf cut from a tree, we know how the story ends, and we're not afraid. Every story has an aftermath, not an ending exactly, because the truest stories, the ones that carry real weight, the ones that have been told and retold across centuries because something in them refuses to stay quiet, those stories do not end so much as they open. They finish their last chapter and then continue invisibly in the lives of the people who have heard them, in the choices those people make, in the way they see the world differently after having traveled through the story than they did before they entered it. The Palm Sunday story is like that. It does not end at the empty tomb, or in the garden where Mary heard her name, or in the locked room where the disciples received the news that changed everything they thought they knew about what was possible. It continues. It has been continuing for 2,000 years. And in a very real sense, it is continuing right now, in this moment, as you listen. But before we speak of that continuation, before we follow the story forward into the world it made, there are people in this story who deserve a final word. People whose lives were permanently altered by the week that began with palm branches and a borrowed donkey. People who remind us, in their very human imperfection, that the story was never only about extraordinary events. It was always, underneath everything, about ordinary people and what happens to them when they encounter something that refuses to leave them unchanged. Let us begin with Peter. Peter, who had walked on water and then sunk, who had declared that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God, and been told he was the rock on which the church would be built, who had protested loudly at the Last Supper that he would never deny Jesus, who had reached for a sword in the garden, who had warmed his hands at a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest's house and said 3 times, with increasing desperation, I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. And who had gone outside and wept bitterly. After the resurrection, John's Gospel tells us, the risen Jesus appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. They had gone back to the lake, back to the fishing boats, back to the life they had known before any of this began. Perhaps because they didn't know what else to do. Perhaps because the locked room in Jerusalem had become unbearable. Perhaps because when everything you thought you understood has been shattered and rebuilt in ways you still can't fully comprehend, sometimes you just need the familiarity of water and wood and the smell of fish and the rhythm of work your hands have always known. Jesus appeared on the shore in the early morning. and they didn't recognize him first. He called out to them across the water, asking if they had caught anything. They hadn't. He told them to throw the net on the right side of the boat. They did, and the net filled with fish, 153 of them. John tells us, with the particular specificity of someone who was there and remembered the exact number. And John recognized him first. He said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Peter, characteristically, immediately jumped into the water and swam to shore. Jesus had a charcoal fire burning on the beach, bread and fish already cooking. He invited them to come and eat, and they sat together in the early morning light by the lake, and he served them breakfast. A charcoal fire, the same Greek word used for the fire in the courtyard of the high priest's house. The fire beside which Peter had warmed his hands and denied knowing Jesus 3 times. It is the only time this specific word appears in John's gospel, and it is not accidental. John is a careful, deliberate writer. The charcoal fire on the beach was meant to echo the charcoal fire in the courtyard. It was meant to bring that memory back. After breakfast, Jesus turned to Peter, and he asked him 3 times a question. The same question 3 times. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" 3 times. One for each denial. One for each moment at the courtyard fire when Peter had said, "I don't know him." Jesus was not rubbing it in. He was not punishing Peter or making him squirm. He was doing something far more gracious and far more surgical. He was going back to the exact place where Peter had broken, and he was rebuilding it. 3 denials, 3 affirmations. The wound acknowledged and then gently and completely healed. Each time Peter said yes, Jesus gave him an instruction. "Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep." He was not dismissing Peter from the story because of what had happened in the courtyard. He was not saying, "You failed at the crucial moment, so someone else will carry this forward." He was reinstating him, restoring him, giving him, again and in fuller measure, the work he had been called to. Peter went on to become one of the central figures in the early church. The frightened man who had denied knowing Jesus in a courtyard would stand up in public, in Jerusalem, weeks later, and preach the resurrection to thousands of people. He would be imprisoned for it. He would be beaten for it. And according to tradition, he would eventually die for it. Crucified, it is said, upside down, because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. The man who ran from the garden became the man who would not run from anything. This is what restoration looks like in this story. Not erasure of the failure, not pretending it didn't happen, but a returning to the exact place of the wound and a rebuilding that is, if anything, stronger than what was there before. And then there is Mary Magdalene, the woman who stayed at the tomb when the disciples went home, the woman who stood weeping in the garden and heard her name spoken by someone she had thought was dead. She has been called, in Christian tradition, the apostle to the apostles because she was the first person to carry the news of the resurrection, and she carried it to the people who would carry it to the world. Very little is known about Mary Magdalene's life before she appears in the gospel accounts as one of Jesus' followers. Luke mentions, briefly, that 7 demons had been cast out of her, suggesting a history of profound suffering, of something that had held her captive and from which she had been freed. Whatever it was, it had apparently been significant enough that her deliverance was worth noting. And it had clearly left her with a loyalty and a love for Jesus that did not waver, even when everything else had fallen apart. She was at the cross when the disciples were scattered. She was at the tomb early on Sunday morning when it would have been easier and safer and more sensible to stay behind the locked doors with everyone else. She was looking for him even when she believed he was dead, even when looking for him had no rational hope attached to it. She simply could not stop, and she was the one he appeared to first, not to Peter, the rock of the church, not to John, the beloved disciple, to Mary, weeping in a garden, mistaking him for the gardener, until he said her name. There is something in this that the Christian tradition has always found profoundly meaningful. The first witness to the resurrection, the person given the most important news in human history to carry, was a woman in a culture that did not consider women reliable witnesses in a court of law. The first Easter sermon was preached informally, tearfully, joyfully, by someone the world would have considered an unlikely choice. I have seen the Lord, for words that changed everything. And then there are the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, a story Luke tells with particular beauty and care. On the afternoon of that first Easter Sunday, two of Jesus' followers were walking from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles away. They were talking as they walked, processing everything that had happened. The arrest, the trials, the crucifixion, the strange reports from the women that morning about an empty tomb and angels. A stranger fell in a step beside them and asked what they were discussing. They stopped, their faces downcast, and one of them said, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And the stranger asked, "What things?" And they told him, about Jesus of Nazareth, about how they had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, about the crucifixion, about the third day now having come, and the women's report and the empty tomb. They told the whole story, and at the center of it was this: we had hoped. Past tense. We had hoped. The stranger listened, and then he began to speak to them, going back through the scriptures, through Moses and all the prophets, explaining how everything that had been written pointed toward this, how the suffering was not a contradiction of the promise, but the fulfillment of it, how the path to glory had always, in this story, run through the valley rather than around it. They reached Emmaus as evening was coming on. The strangers seemed about to continue further, but they urged him to stay. "It is nearly evening," they said. "The day is almost over. Stay with us." And he went in with them, and at the table, a table, again, at evening, with bread, he took the bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road, while he opened the scriptures to us? Were not our hearts burning within us?" They had felt it on the road, without knowing what it was. Something had been stirring in them as the stranger spoke, some recognition below the level of conscious thought, some warmth kindling in the chest that they hadn't been able to name. And now they knew what it was. It was recognition. It was the same presence they had walked with for 3 years, now walking beside them on a road toward evening, in a form they almost didn't see. They got up immediately. It says that very hour, despite the late hour, despite the 7 miles they had just walked, and they went back to Jerusalem to tell the others. These stories of encounter after the resurrection are as varied as the people who experienced them. Some recognized Jesus immediately. Some didn't recognize him at all until a specific moment. The breaking of bread, the speaking of a name, the showing of wounds in hands and side. Some doubted even when they saw him. And he met their doubt not with rebuke, but with an invitation to touch, to see, to be certain. Thomas, who has carried the label doubter through all of Christian history, was told simply, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Stop doubting and believe." Not a condemnation of the doubt, an invitation through it. This, too, is part of what Palm Sunday begins. Not just the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, not just the week of teaching and confrontation, not just the Last Supper and the garden and the cross and the empty tomb, but this, the patient, repeated, endlessly varied work of meeting people exactly where they are. On a road, in a garden, by a lake at dawn, in an upper room with locked doors, wherever they are, however they are, weeping, doubting, fishing, walking away from the city where their hopes had seemed to die. He meets them there, every time, by whatever road they are walking. And now, 2,000 years later, here we are, at the end of this story, or rather at the place where this particular telling of it pauses and opens its hands and gives it back to you. The story of Palm Sunday has been traveling a long time to reach this moment. It has traveled through the gospel accounts written in the first century, through the early church fathers who quoted and commented and argued and prayed over it, through the great councils and the monastery scriptoriums where monks copied it by hand in the candlelight, through the printing press and the translations and the missionaries and the centuries of Christians who have carried it across the world in every direction. It has been told in Greek and Latin and Coptic and Armenian and Syriac and English and Mandarin and Swahili and 1,000 other languages. It has been told in times of peace and times of war, in prosperity and in persecution, in great cathedrals and in whispers. And it arrives here, in this moment, for you. There's a reason this story has survived what it has survived. There's a reason that 2,000 years of human history, with all its upheaval and change, and the rising and falling of empires, and the transformation of every imaginable aspect of human life, has not been able to quiet this story or set it aside or replace it with something that works better. It is because the story is true, not just historically true, though the Christian faith has always insisted on its historical reality, on the fact that these things happened in actual time and actual space, on a real road outside a real city, in a real garden, on a real hill, in a real tomb that was really found empty on a real Sunday morning. But true in the deeper sense. True in the way that speaks to something underneath all the noise and busyness of life. Something in the very center of what it means to be human. Something that recognizes itself in this story the way you recognize your own face in a mirror. We know what it is to wait for something, to hope for deliverance, to wave our branches at the thing we believe might save us, and then to find, sometimes, that it doesn't save us in the way we expected, but saves us in a way we couldn't have imagined, and wouldn't have chosen, and couldn't live without. We know what it is to be in the middle of a week that has grown darker than we anticipated, to be in that Saturday silence, waiting without knowing what we are waiting for, to have our hopes interrupted and our certainties dismantled, and our understanding of how the story was supposed to go turned entirely upside down. And we know, or we long to know, what it is to hear our names spoken in a garden by someone we thought was gone, to have the stone rolled away from whatever tomb our grief has sealed us in, to feel our hearts burning within us on a road we thought was leading nowhere, and to realize, looking back, that we were not alone on it. This is the gift of Palm Sunday, not just a historical commemoration, not just a religious observance, but an invitation to enter a story that is still, somehow, unfolding, to pick up a palm branch, a symbol of victory, of overcoming, of something endured and transcended, and to wave it at the one who comes still in the name of the Lord, humble, unhurried, on a road that leads through the darkest possible valley and out the other side into a light that nothing, in the end, can extinguish. The crowd on that Sunday morning got something right, even if they didn't fully understand what they were doing. They recognized, with whatever part of us recognizes things before the mind is caught up, that something was happening, that the one riding toward them on a donkey was worth their cloaks and their branches and their voices, that the cry rising in their throats, "Hosanna, save us now," was the truest thing they had said in years, maybe ever. They were right. He was worth it. He is worth it still. And the road he rode down that morning, dusty, lined with palm branches, ringing with the voices of ordinary people who have been waiting a very long time for something to change. That road did not end at Golgotha. It did not end at the sealed tomb. It did not even end at the empty tomb, extraordinary as that morning was. It goes on. It has always gone on. It goes on through every person who has ever heard this story and felt something stir in them that they couldn't quite explain. Through every act of love offered without counting the cost. Through every moment of forgiveness extended across an impossible distance. Through every locked room that has been entered by a presence that does not require doors. Through every garden where someone has heard their name spoken in the early morning and known, with a certainty beyond argument, that they were known and loved and not abandoned. The road goes on, and you are on it, wherever you are, whatever week you're in the middle of, whether it feels like Sunday with the palm branches waving and the singing bright around you, or whether it feels like Friday with the darkness pressing in from all sides, or whether it feels like Saturday, that long, silent, uncertain Saturday of waiting without knowing. The road goes on, and the one who rode down it on a borrowed donkey, weeping over a city he loved, clearing a temple that had forgotten what it was for, telling stories in the afternoon light, washing feet in an upper room, praying alone among the olive trees, dying on a hill outside the city walls, and walking out of a garden tomb in the early morning while the world was still dark. That one is still on the road, still meeting people where they are, still speaking names in gardens, still breaking bread at tables in the evening, still asking, "Do you love me?" Still saying, "Follow me." Still saying, to everyone who has ever felt the weight of everything they have done and everything they have failed to do, friend. Just that, friend. The palm branches are dry now. The road is quiet. The city of Jerusalem has changed beyond all recognition from the one that shimmered in the spring sunlight on that Sunday morning 2,000 years ago. But the story is not finished. It never was. It was never meant to be. It is meant to go on, and on, and on, all the way to you. This concludes our journey through the history and significance of Palm Sunday. If you're looking for resources to help you relax and sleep better naturally, check out the link in the video description below. Don't forget to like this video, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again for listening, and have a good night.